But we've got now a younger generation that says when they hear the word socialism, they respond much more positively than when they hear the word capitalism. That's a fundamental shift in consciousness. But by socialism in the eyes of most of our precious young folk of all colors, what they mean is more democracy, more equality, and more freedom. They don't have an obsession with the ism. They just know that this capitalism, as it has been enacted in the last 30 years or so that they have grown, the period in which they have grown up, tends to be so shot through with a spiritual malnutrition and a moral constipation. And they're tired of it. Because most of them have a sense of what's right, but the greed is so hegemonic it doesn't flow. Right. Money, 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 Benjamins, power, 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 women as object of sexual conquest. Get your billions and still be empty. Get your billions and still be unhappy.
Welcome once again to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. Our guest today on The Radical Imagination has been described as the greatest theological ethicist of the 21st century, our most compelling political theologian, the preeminent social ethicist in North America today, and the most rigorous theological historian of our time. Gary Dorrien is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Religion at Columbia University, the author of over 20 books and 300 articles that range across the fields of social ethics, philosophy, theology, political economics, social and political theory, religious history, cultural criticisms, and intellectual history. Gary's most recent book is the third volume of his trilogy on the Black social gospel, a darkly radiant vision, the Black social gospel in the shadow of Martin Luther King. His forthcoming memoir, Over from Union Road, My Christian Left Intellectual Life, will be published in November of this year. In 2024, Gary was awarded the Gandhi King Mandela Peace Prize at Morehouse College in Atlanta. With all his many, many academic and scholarly accomplishments, Gary describes himself as a jock who began as a solidarity activist, became an Episcopal cleric at age 30, an academic at age 35, never quite settled on a field, so now explores the intersections of too many fields. I'm sure that Gary would agree that God does work in numerous and mysterious ways. So, Gary, thank you very much. I'm just really blessed and thrilled to have you here, and there's so much to talk with you about. And thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I'm so grateful that you asked. I've long admired your work and grateful for it. So.
Thank you so very much. Well, I did get a chance to touch on large chunks of your memoir, and settling down in my comfortable living room chair here, and don't even get to the second page, and we're hit full force with the following statement, and let me quote. You're a 9-year-old child, and you've retreated once again to your backyard in semi-rural Bay County, Michigan. You live 2 miles outside Midland on a dirt road. To the right are the shacks and trailers of West North Union Road. To the left are the working class homes of your baseball buddies on Bajolo Road. Somehow, we must move at least 2 miles west for my Midland football dream to become true. A railroad track near our home services long freight trains with a smattering of wide open empty chairs. I have a recurrent fantasy, and here we are on page 2, of whisking far away on a train, which feels perfectly normal to me. I also fantasize about throwing myself in front of a train, which always unleashes a cascade of shame. Think what it would do to your mother. But I do not think of that flight to the backyard. I pondered that God is everywhere, that Jesus was cruelly executed on a cross, and that I cannot catch the I am saying, I am myself. Now, that's just in the first page and a half here. So here you are, a 9-year-old boy. There's a beautiful little picture of you, very cute, adorable, riding your bicycle. And then we settle down, and here we are, page 2. So tell us what was going on. Tell us a little about your family background and the struggles you're having, the conflicts, what's going on in your mind here.
Thanks, Jim. Firstly, I think I'll say, this book doesn't come out until sometime next month.
Right.
So I'm not at all in practice yet in talking about it. I'm just starting to get up the, goodness, what am I going to say about all this? My parents were both Yoopers. They came from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, so poor and very rural. And my mother was deeply and very poorly rural. My father grew up assaulted, really, as a half-breed, because his mother was Native American, and so he grew up just wanting to get out of the UP. He had this idea that if he could just move away from the UP, he could get his own a different start in life, where he could pass as racially indeterminate. So, these are people who have no concept of, no language about going for all the white privilege you can get. And yet that's exactly what his life is all about, is just to get out of the UP so he can be somebody else, somewhere else. But meanwhile, he ends up marrying the blonde beauty from his own high school class.
The beauty queen. Yes.
He makes her promise on the way to Midland. And he got to Midland, in the middle of Michigan, because his older brother, who had served in the war, now worked for the Dow Chemical Company in Midland. So Midland is something that's just in his head as a place to go, as a destination, and drives to Midland and makes her promise that she will never talk about their Native American past or the like, any of it. And his mother conveniently died when I was 2 months old. And boy, he took the occasion to just cut us off.
Wow.
For that part of the family. My mother was proud of marrying a man with a Cree heritage, and he was ashamed of it. And he was wounded in a way that made it very, very difficult for him to ever kind of show up for other people. He fled from people. And he was kindly and polite and so on, decorous in his own way, but not someone who had dealt with life by just kind of withholding himself.
His emotions, deeply troubled.
My youth is all about just struggling to have a relationship with him. That mattered to me far more than anything else. I even became a pretty close to a scratch golfer just because it meant time with him. Years of caddying for him, and then ending up in his group, and then making him proud of me, and it's not even my sport, but I did practice assiduously and got pretty good at it just because that's where he was, and that was the road to having a relationship with my father.
Wow. So golf itself may have been the sport he chose, of a very sort of upwardly mobile, if you will, sport that more of the middle or upper middle class participated. Meanwhile, you wanted to get on the football team and the baseball team, and your mother was very religious, correct? Catholic, is that?
Well, no, she grew up Catholic.
She grew up Catholic.
Then her mom, when my mother was about 11 years old, her mother joined the Baptists, fundamentalist Baptists, which to my mother was the great catastrophe of her life, because at least the Catholic Mass had dignity, and now she's being subjected to these fundamentalist sermons about hellfire and the Bible is inerrant and all of that, and she hated it. So for my mother, having to just withstand the assault of fundamentalist religion growing up was really the issue in her life, and her own conflicted relationship, shall we say, with her mother. So the fact that my father had grown up Catholic, that was the occasion for my mother to say, okay, I'm going to go back to what I was raised in. I'll be Catholic. And we were Catholic. We were not that Catholic. I was far more Catholic than anybody else in my family.
Why is that? Why do you think that was the case, Gary?
Oh, I always had kind of a spiritual germ. Just some concept of transcendence, something that gets you out of Bay County. The sheer everyday plainness, the prosaic meaninglessness of life in this, very rural dirt road existence that I have, where I'm forbidden even from turning right and visiting any of those people down there, because that's just all shacks and trailers. That to picture myself out of that, just to be impacted by something beyond what the givenness of the world that I'm in. Yeah, that's my first kind of religious something. And then, of course, getting to Catholic Mass and seeing that picture, that cross overhanging the altar. This idea that, wow, in this religion, the God figure suffers on a cross, and this sheer strangeness of that how repelling it is, but also fixating, and to me, in some ways, just true. That caught me like nothing else religiously during those years. And I didn't grow up with any kind of theology or anything like that. But I did get myself to Mass far more often than my family did, because I'd go hitch a ride with the neighbors, because there's something definitely way outside of Bay County. That's that issue that's being talked about when you go to church. And you have this Catholic soul, so
right. Now your schooling wasn't much either at that point. I mean, you could tell it was. You felt it was an inferior education, so that your mother wanted to very much to go to college, right? And was stifled doing that. So there was a lot of pressure on you eventually to fulfill her dreams, in a sense, by going to college. Is that
well, she went to college. She got to college for 1 year, which was highly unusual. I mean, this very, very poor. I mean, no electricity, no inside bathroom, nothing. That kind of poverty out in the middle of a forest growing up. So nobody in her life world went to college, except she won a scholarship she was actually able to go to Northern Michigan in Marquette for a year. But then, my father was trying to avoid the Korean War and wanted very much not to lose his high school sweetheart, and so offered to marry her. And she, that's what people of her generation did. And she immediately had regrets about it. I mean, I grew up with her intense anguish at having lost her chance to finish college. So this is just the fiercest, deepest sort of memory imprinted, on my little psyche growing up, as she would say, when you grow up, you will go to college and you will finish college. And her just the sheer, the pain that she had over it, and frankly, the rage that she experienced during those years, what ended up being visited on me to a considerable extent. Yeah, that's a big part of my psyche. But so I was always aware of being deeply, intensely close to her, bonded to her. But of course, the one I want to be able to know my father. And when he was a softball player early on, but then when a neighbor took him golfing, my dad discovered the great passion of his life, and now he's just dogging a blue streak of golf the rest of his life, and bringing clubs home and golf magazines, and just dogging a blue streak about how Arnie swings and how he's different from Jack Nicklaus and all of that. That's what I grew up with.
Interesting. So there was a lot going. How many years were they married?
Oh, 70 years.
70 years. So that
they both lived into their 90s. Well, my father almost 90.
Yeah. So that conversation, if you want to call it a conversation, continued on, as you say here, for 70 years. I mean, so the flame of conflict, in a sense, continued for 70 years between them.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And my dad used to claim that my mother was failing all her classes anyway, so it didn't matter that he pulled her out of college. And it made her angry every time he said it. It wasn't true, and yet he kept it up for 70 years. It's just they both have kind of wounded pride on both sides of this story. That you didn't give up anything by marrying me, and boy, she certainly thought she did.
Wow.
And yet the just even the conflict over this story is something of a bond between them, because neither of them could have stood to be apart from the other for more than a week ever, the whole time they were married. But boy, they sure fought.
Yes, and again, one last point. So the emotionality within the household was a lot of repression, a lot of denial, and sporadic flare-ups. How would you describe the atmosphere? Were there books or music? There was
Jim,
no.
There certainly was repression and denial so far as this Native American heritage aspect goes. I mean, that is a conscious thing. There's something terribly real in our family that we are squelching. And my dad worked so hard at just making sure we had almost no contact with that side of his family, except of course he had sisters and brothers where they had never had any chance whatsoever of passing. The issue of passing as not being Native American was just not an option for them. And later in life it wouldn't have been for him either, but when he was 18, 19, it was a possibility. And so that really was, you had to be self-conscious about that. They did. But otherwise they didn't think of themselves as being repressed in any way. They're just trying to get into this American success dream story, where we've the first move to make is get out of the UP, get into a place where there's the ceiling is just higher, and you can put your kids in better schools than the ones we went to, and so on. Except we weren't. We're out there in Bay County, and these are terrible schools.
Yeah.
And
it's hard to break out of that.
I was on my parents. We got to get out of here. This is terrible. And I worked on them. Well, for them to have gotten this little bitty house out in Bay County, which they only had because my grandfather, gave them money to be able to put down a down payment. To them, this is some great prize that they were able to even get have a house of any kind. And now they've got children who are saying, oh, we got to get out of here. And indeed, when Bay County schools went down to half days, my parents dug down deep. I mean, they realized it's indeed, we cannot have our kids in schools that are only lasting half a day. Just the sheer what you do with them is an issue. So it was difficult for them, but they pulled it together and moved 3 miles actually, east, west, so that they were just inside the Midlands city limit. And so I went to Midland High School.
And you read incessantly, and that's what really kept you going. And again, you mentioned Reddick's book that crosses your path. The Reddick Reader about MLK, and MLK's book Stride Toward Freedom. So how did these books sustain you? What impact did they have? And how was that connected to your later interest in writing this remarkable book on the Black social gospel, which is a topic that, as you point out, the Black social gospel is wrongly and strangely overlooked. Few books refer to it. There are no books in this tradition as a whole, and the phrase registers almost nothing on Google. Yet this is the category that best describes Martin Luther King Jr., his chief mentors, his closest movement allies, and the entire tradition of Black church racial justice activism reaching back to the 1880s. So was that the reading of Reddick and King, how important was that, and to your own intellectual growth and spiritual growth? And then how is that connected again to this incredible work that you've been involved in, the trilogy?
Well, thanks. Firstly, I'll say a word about that quote because, of course, it was true when I wrote it in 2015.
2015, yes.
That's kind of summary about the state of things. And in fact, I had this argument about the Black social gospel in my head for 20 years at that point. That is, I am one of those people who've written about the social gospel for years. And for many years, I had sprinkled my argument about the enormous importance of this overlooked tradition, the Black social gospel. I had sprinkled it into numerous books because I had the argument from the mid-90s on in my head that this is the great piece that's missing from a religious historiography, from American letters itself, and that in fact you can't even answer the question, where did Martin Luther King Jr. come from, without knowing about this tradition, and yet we don't have any literature about it. So for many years, I urged people, we need somebody better than me to write up, that story, and you can't even do it in one volume. It took me 3 enormous volumes to do it once I finally did. But for a long time, I resisted it being me. I had to be, pulled into it and convinced that it was getting too late almost even for me. So you better do it. But everything that's in that project it has to do with just even the story of my own life, what first caught me, my first kind of book reading obsession comes from this. Again, there's the civil rights movement is in its heyday, and there was the March on Washington, and then there was Birmingham, children marching and saving this incredible demonstration in Birmingham, and then of course Selma in 1965, and this is when I'm in junior high school during this period. So just needing to know, what is that? What is the civil rights movement? And this extraordinary, display of preaching and protest activism and violence against it. And Martin Luther King himself is this incredible, sort of galvanizing figure who was fully that figure to me when I'm now, in the 9th grade in the mid 1960s.
A Christ-like figure. A Christ-like figure.
Well, this is what I was going for. Is that he was all of that to me before he became the one who died for us. Yes, because I was a junior in high school, when he was cut down. And so then when he's assassinated, now he becomes a Jesus figure. He's not just the leader of America's greatest liberation movement. He's now these two kind of cross stories, both kind of meld together in my thought and feeling. So my way in, besides what you would just see on television or read in the journalism of that period about the movement, was the Reddick book. And Reddick was an insider who wrote the first good biography of King. Well, the first biography period of
Crusader King. Without Violence.
Crusader Without Violence. Yeah.
Right. But let's step back. I'm sorry. Excuse me, sir. Okay. I just want to step back for 1 minute for our audience. Give us a little bit of a background when we're talking about social gospel. We're talking basically what? Protestant, liberal theologians, or tell us a little bit of a background of that. And then we move on again to the Black social gospel movement. Yeah.
The social gospel movement, there is a famous social gospel movement that grew up in the 1880s, and that built all the peace and justice fellowships in the churches, and that transformed places like where I teach at Union Seminary. They all became social gospel institutions, because the social gospel is quite literally the argument that churches should be involved in struggles for social justice. That is it. That the church simply isn't being true to the gospel if it's not being involved in and supporting struggles for social justice. And usually that just means identify the reform movements that are out there already, because the reform movements have already identified where the places of suffering and pain and vulnerability and injustice are in society. And so we should be involved. We should be supporting them. But where they don't exist, yes, it's on us to try to create them. Try to create the NAACP if there's not a protest organization that does what that's about. So that's the social gospel. And it's always controversial, because church people can say, that's not what Christianity's about. When has the church ever been about that? And these early social gospelers, both in the white church and in the black churches, the only answer they really could give that was historical would be to say, well, there was abolition just a generation ago. There was that abolition movement, which did, in fact, pull people out of their churches and got them involved in.
And then the suffragette movement as well. But
of course, that's after.
After.
I mean, that's.
We bring in.
I don't mean to say just that. It succeeded afterward. Yes, it's part
Absolutely.
of it.
But
lots of feminists in this social gospel movement, because
Absolutely.
Indeed, now the issue that they're privileging is, what about us? What about voting? Yes.
Exactly. Now, can we make the connection to the Hebrew scriptures? Is there some connection here with the Hebrew prophetic tradition that you're also very familiar with? That we've talked about Michael Lerner, his passing at Tikkun magazine, healing Abraham Joshua Heschel's I Pray With My Feet, and so on. What connection does that have with what you're talking about?
The two claims that are always made here within the social gospel, within all the differences, because there are plenty of differences among black and white churches, socialist wing and not, the squishy liberal wing, all kinds of things like that. Ideological, theological. The social gospel is a big, big thing. But two things that are just always there with it: a claim about recovering the prophetic tradition in Hebrew scripture. That there's a way of reading Hebrew scripture that's just wrong if you just see it, if you just read, priestly narrative, or just see it as some way of backstopping or creating a merely personal religion that never gets involved in struggles for justice. So you always have that claim that we're recovering the prophetic strain of Hebrew scripture, and moving forward in the Christian Testament, that we're recovering the kingdom of God. That is the idea of the commonwealth of God, or reign of God, in which, that brings God into everything that actually matters in life. And it isn't just a story about, individuals wanting to go to heaven.
Right.
Like that.
The Protestant work ethic.
Things are always there in the social gospel.
Right. But it's also, Heschel saying God in search of man.
That's right.
Right.
Heschel wrote his doctoral dissertation on the prophets. And it was in his head for so long. The first march he was ever in was Selma.
Yeah.
So it's not like he's this great, protest guy, or was really involved in movements until actually quite late in his life. And yet he had the theology for it all along, because he knew what Hebrew scripture is supposed to be about.
But as I understand, he was treated rather shabbily at Jewish Theological Seminary. Did he teach a course also cross-listed at Union? Am I wrong on that?
But Jim, that's just the usual story. The way the treatment he got at JTS. Well, it's the same thing these social gospelers usually get. Yeah. This is always controversial. This is always a minority who says, no, this is part of being religious. You're not true to the gospel. You're not true to biblical faith if we're not doing the work of justice. And that argument is always unpopular in churches. I don't mean that it never wins. That certainly on the white side, the white social gospel achieved great sort of victories, took over entire institutions, changed liberal Protestant churches. And of course, on the black side, of course, this is my whole argument, is that that's what gets you to the civil rights movement. That's what gets you to Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and so on. That's where it came from. So there you have a tremendous success coming out of it. And yet, even there, even at its heyday, of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and passing the civil rights bills and all that, it's still just a minority of black churches that were ever involved in that.
And we're also saying that King had gone too far in his criticism of the Vietnam War and so on. So he had a minority of support within his own people with that. So here again,
you're right. That's such an important thing. He made it really hard, even for the group he's got. They're a minority to begin with. In Birmingham, they had about 230 black pastors in that area. No more than 25 were involved in the demonstrations in Birmingham. So that's what he's always dealing with. His own denomination not only didn't support him, they repudiated him. He had a fight within his own denomination and had to leave. This is the great Martin Luther King, and he can't even find support in his own denomination. So that was hard enough. And then, move forward to 1967, and he comes out against the Vietnam War. Oh my God. It's just felt like the wrath of God for a while for him because of all the fallout from that, which he knew was coming.
He knew it was coming, and he felt it, and his anger increased, I think, as you put it, from 1955, 65. He wasn't cynical, but he was despairing in a sense.
Yeah.
His level of depression about it, he still kept on keeping on, but he really took it very, very hard, didn't he? And we have people today, of course, our good friend and colleague, Cornel West, who carries on that tradition, who is so imbued with that story, and of course, Reverend William Barber, who you talk about in this in your books as well. Are they the legacy as well of the Black social gospel movement? And how, if they are, which I think they are, how is that so? How are they carrying on that tradition? And combining, if you will, the roots in this great book of yours, American Democratic Socialism. How are they also combining revolutionary progressive Christianity, if you will, the prophetic tradition, and the progressive political movements of our day? I mean, King tried to do that as well, right?
Yes. Well, firstly, I'd say my Black Social Gospel work, it's 3 volumes and 3 big ones. So it has to begin where it begins in the late 1870s. And this is a moment in which Black church pastors are simply having to ask the terrible question, well, what would a new abolition be? I mean, we've come through abolition, and now the Civil War, and now even Reconstruction has come and gone. And now we've got this mania of lynching going on in the country, and we barely got the 14th and 15th Amendments squeaked through, and now they're just being shredded in much of the country that barely had a moment of existence. And so now in this terrible situation in which in some ways it's worse than ever, than it's ever been, even than what the abolitionists had to deal with. What would a new abolition be? And that's my argument is, that's the beginning of the Black social gospel tradition. And my volume 1 story is complex. There's various ideologies in here and various theologies, and I just have to be able to handle all of it in 1 volume. When I get to volume 2, there's something simpler there, because that civil rights movement story, 1955 to 1968, is something so particular and so enormously important. And it centers around, really one organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then later, SNCC as well. That it's not as complex a story in terms of ideological and theological diversity and the like, because there's something so particular to track. But then when you get back, to volume 3, as it opens up again, it gets more, diverse and different kinds of theologies and arguments about religious studies and different kinds of Black theology. I mean, this is when Black theology comes along, and you have to
right? Liberation theology.
Absolutely, yes.
Black power.
But that's never just one thing. Right from the beginning, there are 3 different Black theologies. There isn't just Cone. There's Jim Cone and J.D. Otis Roberts and Gayrod Wilmore. That's 3 different kinds of Black theology right there. So I've got an ideologically complex story that with intertwining motifs that I need to be able to tell in the 3rd volume. But now I'm getting somewhere. When you mentioned William Barber, I did always sort of have it in mind that I need to, when I get to the very end of this, I need to drive the whole thing toward a couple of figures who could have been in any decade of this whole 2-century story, who are just so quintessentially representing what this tradition has always been at its center, and still is. And those 2 people are Tracy Blackman and William Barber. that you could, no matter where you were in this story, you would recognize it, that they were right at the very center of it. The way they talk about it today is the same way that their own, people before them understood the gospel and how it relates to politics and all of that.
And King too is not talking about simply a Southern phase of the civil rights movement. He's talking about universal human rights, as does Blackman and Barber, correct? So first and foremost, we need to formulate an internationalist view of spiritual progressives.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, as you know, I mean, once he's done in Selma, I mean, once the Great Selma demonstration is over, now you have a debate within. I mean, this is when he starts to say, okay, now we have to take the struggle north. And there were plenty of people who said, no, we shouldn't do that. We are a Southern outfit. We understand small Southern towns, and what we do is effective here. But people like Bayard Rust and others said, you try to go to a place like Chicago, and this will be a very, very different situation. But King has, as you say, has a sort of concept of what this movement is that can't just keep replicating what they've been doing in these Southern towns. And meanwhile, during that very same period, that's when Vincent Harding came to the SCLC convention and laid it on the line to tell them we need to put it on the line against the Vietnam War, because this has been decades in the making, and the United States has made a series of wrong moves here. Every one of them was wrong, and now we're in this situation where Lyndon Johnson is massively sort of escalating the war, and Harding knows that King is having these anguished discussions with Johnson, where Johnson is saying things to King about how difficult this is and how terrible it could turn out. So Harding is aware of how the wheels that are turning here, and what is at stake if they turn against the very president who's just signed the civil rights bills, their friend in the White House, right? What the fallout from then? And King says, for 2 years, it's not like he had ever disagreed with Vincent Harding. He thought Harding was right about the war, and that it was just a colossal catastrophe that the United States went into Vietnam the way it did. But it's going to be massive fallout for the civil rights movement if he comes out against the war. So, he did, over those next couple of years, he would occasionally sprinkle something about it. It's not like we didn't know that King was against the war, but he wasn't an anti-war leader. He didn't put it all on the line in a speech that was saying, this is what we all need to be doing. He didn't do that.
Colonial, anti-imperialist as well, because that's what King was really about, the militant King that Cornell writes about.
April 4th,
about.
April 4th, 1967. Vincent Harding and John McGuire write the Riverside Address, and it's a deeply anti-imperialist address, and it's expansive, it's visionary, talking about and it's appalling to the civil rights establishment. Oh my God, this isn't the civil rights movement. You're going to destroy the civil rights movement if now we're supposed to be involved in the anti-war movement, and we're going to betray our friend in the White House and be against him and all of that. And for a while, there was about a 6-week period when the reviews were so bad. King got the worst backlash he had ever gotten in his life, and he was just battered by it. He teased Vincent Harding, say, "Look what you've done to me." But of course, that's the King that we for a while downplayed because we needed to get the holiday. But that's the King that we needed most of all.
But Gary, now weave in the New Left narrative for our audience to understand the impact that may have had. Tom Hayden was one of those who started organizing in the Black communities in Newark. But then as it evolves, we're talking about a lot of white middle class, upper middle class kids who are really not seeing that connection with the civil rights movement as much as sort of Hayden does. So tell us about some of the struggles within the New Left and connecting to King's vision?
Well, for a while, you have this fabulous organization, SNCC, SNCC, that actually is a New Left organization. It doesn't talk about itself precisely that way because it realizes what has given it its origin. I mean, it's the rebirth of the civil rights movement, a civil rights movement that had, in the late 1950s, King had gone to India and he was great at giving talks about Gandhian nonviolent resistance, but he wasn't doing any. And the reason was, of course, King is sensitive and peaceable and kindly. And the thought that he's going to get people killed by having them lay their bodies on the line, or maybe be asked to put his own on the line, he was not for that. This is what got the movement got stuck in the late 1950s because they took these southern towns, they all took away the one issue that had worked the best. That's the busing issue, right? They all realized, oh no, there's real leverage there with busing. So they all took that one away. And so now you can't just do a busing boycott the way you did in Montgomery and have it keep gathering momentum. And so for a while they really stalled out. And what SNCC was part of course, in 1960, was a kind of relighting the fire. And now you've got a whole younger generation of people starting at Vanderbilt in Nashville. Those people that Jim Lawson trained at Vanderbilt and in Nashville that ended up putting their bodies on the line and starting up now this kind of electrifying new kind of generation of civil rights activism. And King had to scramble to get with this, to realize that, wow, this very debate that he's been having with himself for the past 3 years about just what do I even do next? How do I translate Gandhian activism to this context in which I'm going to be asking people to get killed? James Lawson solved that problem for him by training those students there, and they were doing it. And then, of course, SNCC came out of that whole moment, that movement. So SNCC for a while was the very answer to this question. Meanwhile, of course, you had another a parallel organization, SDS, and there were some people who were involved in both. Who are in both. You mentioned one of them, Tom Hayden. Casey Hayden was another one who were involved in both. But these were two different sort of organizations. And it was in SDS, which is mostly white, middle class, and radical, where these are younger people who formed at the Port Huron Conference in 1962. And they're the ones who provided some of the language that we have for even the word New Left, right? Just even that is a kind of conceit of a next generation that says, we don't identify with that old left. And all those arguments about Marxism and are you the right kind of Marxist and are you anti-communist and all this stuff about trade unions that we don't relate to because we're middle-class college students. And this is 1962, not 1932. So that the New Left in the SDS has those kind of origins. And there are important overlaps between them. And then they have kind of parallel histories through the 1960s. Both of them just fabulous organizations. And yet both of them did have kind of implosive
self-destructive tendencies.
That just blew them both up. Yeah,
blew them both up. Yeah, right, exactly. So, and then I know we're doing this fast and all that, but we want to bring us up to the present here. Black Lives Matter. What is the legacy of Black Lives Matter to the Black social gospel movement that you're talking about as well? The concern about connecting to the abolition of mass incarceration, ending mass incarceration, the content talking about the militarization of the police and making connections to the imperialistic foreign policy and so on. There's a lot to try to tie together here, which again, as you've said, King was grappling with, and so many on the left are still grappling with. And let me say, because I think you eloquently talk about this in your last work here, the struggles that the various protesters have today in your mind, do they represent really a peace movement as such? Are they so divided? And this is what it's hard for me to imagine that King would be supporting some of the rhetoric that has come out of that movement. And would you comment on that? Let me maybe help you out a little bit. Not that you need any help here, but I guess I'm talking about the movement here. What was coming in Gaza? This was back in October here of 2023. You crashed emotionally at the worst possible moment, knowing what was coming in Gaza. Yeah. What did you know there? What did you think was going to happen? My usual orbit of congregations and schools called for a sermon, a talk, and for 5 weeks I begged off from it. Then you begin to share and respect each other's. What you're also saying, or want to say, and did say to some of the demonstrators, is to two historic peoples with rival narratives must find a way to share the land and respect each other's rights to self-determination and safety. You cannot brutally oppress any people anywhere without driving them to desperate rebellion. And furthermore, you go 2 decades of vicious cynicism ensued in Israel-Palestine, contrasting forms of river to the sea conquest ascended on each side. I don't hear that sort of reasoning. God knows there's enough to criticize Netanyahu and his government, etc. But where is the connection to the brutality of Hamas? I think that's what we're needing to do, isn't it? Or, to bring about a sense of fairness and universality of suffering that can be transcended. One last point. I've had on this show a couple of times, combatants for peace. These are ex-Israeli soldiers who've gotten together with Palestinians who've served time in Israeli prisons. They have now come together in a peace movement. Now, this is what I think we need more of. Or what are your comments on that?
Well, firstly, Jim, yes, you have put together. There's a kind of throughput here that you did get. Even these are very disparate contexts.
Yes,
on two sides of this question. And yeah, it does have something to do with just trying to imagine what would MLK be saying in this context. What's consistent with that outlook, knowing that King fought for nonviolence all the time. I mean, it's always embattled. Goodness, those every night, those long meetings they had in Birmingham that went on all night long in 4 or 5 different churches, and he's going from one to another. And what they're mostly having to do in that context is assiduously bring the message home: leave your guns at home. We can't afford to have a single cop. We can't afford to have the blood on our hands of anybody. That's what they're struggling, fighting for it all the time. It's just of the sheer importance of the movement being what it says it is, and personifying, what everything that King cared about. I would say yes, to move further down the road. When Eric Garner went down, we waited to see what would happen here at Union in New York City. You remember it well.
Yeah.
Then Michael Brown was cut down just a month or so later. And then shortly after that, we get the verdict that they're not going to prosecute in the case of Pantaleon for the Eric Garner case. And from that night, for weeks afterward, we were at Union, and lots of us were out in the streets every single night. And I was close. Jim Cohn was my closest friend at Union for over a dozen years, and I saw the impact that it had on Jim to see, to witness Not just that Black people are being cut down in the streets in this way. That has always been the case, except now we're all running around with these cameras on our phones, and so we're getting vivid accountings of what happened, that then sparked mass movements. And for Jim to have spent his last years of his career witnessing a Black Lives Matter movement, I told him at the end, I said, your last book is more like those first two that you wrote than the ones in between. And he says, I know it. I know it's true, right? That there had been nothing close to the feeling, the movement feeling that he felt in 2015, 16, 17. Than what he had felt back in 68, 69, 70. He felt like, this is more like where I came in, where we're actually dealing with this. But it's also in a way that you can't to celebrate it. No, it's not something to celebrate. It's a function of just what's so terrible in this country that we never did really address or solve. So here we are again, having a march because Black people are being cut down in the streets, and we're having to talk about why is this the case. So I think holding on to what is the spirit of Martin Luther King in this context. You look to certain paradigmatic figures who indeed have asked. You need those people who've kind of asked that question every day of their lives, who are indeed you know that that's their center and that's what they're working out of. And even if whatever they get it wrong, at least that's, you see it in them. And certainly Cornell is one of those people. And so is William Barber. And so is Tracy Blackman. Yeah. In his own way, so is Raphael Warnock. Now, Raphael has, now with Raphael, there's an example of someone who, for many years, we didn't have this. I didn't know anybody who got elected, right? We were just so, we knew hardly anybody. And now we're in a moment, we've actually had kind of some mass movements that have succeeded to the degree that some of us who went many years without a single friend in office, now we got a bunch of friends who've actually been elected.
Absolutely. And Gary, since
now you have to deal with that.
You mentioned at the last moment, we are getting into our last moment here on this show. So you're leaving us with this transcendent love that, whatever you want to call it, nature, God, pouring out grace and a radical love, as Cornell puts it. Justice is what love looks like in public, and Reverend Barber as well. So this is where we're at. Seems to be the message that you're leaving us here, at least at this point. Correct?
You go out, you try to have dinner with Cornell. Well, firstly, it's hard to get there because all the people that stop him on the street. Then it's hard to get through the meal because all the people need a picture, and
I know. And the Greek restaurant by Columbia is closed down. That's where he held forth. But let's do that. Let's get together. We can have something at my place here. Let's talk about a bunch of the union people. We'll do some event here. But Gary, thank you so very much. I wish we could go on and on and on. But let's set something up, and just thank you so very much for doing this. It's so enlightening that we could go on for hours. But again, bless you, and I appreciate so much and I know my audience does as well. Appreciates your good works, your good spirits, and your idealism.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you again.
Stay strong.
Okay. Take care. And thank you so very, very much, all of you, for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. See you again next week on The Radical Imagination. And as Gary says, stay strong.